Welcome to Tech Explained. Today, we're covering CCSP Domain 3. We are launching straight into what you might call the foundational layer of modern computing, cloud platform and infrastructure security. Think of this domain as, well, the ultimate balancing act. It's where the physical stuff, the data center, the racks, the wires meets the logical abstraction of virtualization. Understanding this domain is so crucial because it really defines the security contract. You, as the customer, you absolutely need to grasp what protections the provider handles, and maybe even more importantly, what critical security controls you have to build on top of all that infrastructure.
Yeah, the stakes here couldn't be higher, really. The whole security posture of your organization's cloud setup, your confidential data, your critical applications, your ability to keep operating, it all fundamentally rests on the integrity of this underlying infrastructure. If the hypervisor is weak, for instance, or the power grid fails, well, everything else you've carefully built, all the encryption, access policies, it just becomes irrelevant.
Yeah.
So we're going to explore how these established security principles get applied in this cloud context. And often it's in ways that are pretty radically different from traditional on-premise security. Responsibility shifts, you know, and the consequences of failure can be magnified significantly.
Right. So we absolutely have to begin at the literal ground level. The physical plant, the building itself, and its environmental security controls. These are almost entirely the cloud provider's responsibility, their burden. But the customer, you still need to audit and fundamentally trust this foundation.
Exactly. Let's talk about provider responsibility for that physical plant. When a provider decides, okay, we're building a data center, the location strategy alone is a massive undertaking. It involves balancing all these conflicting requirements. It's definitely not just about finding cheap land somewhere.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
You need incredibly reliable, massive access to utilities. We're talking uninterrupted power and just colossal amounts of water for cooling. And often, the places where those utilities are most stable and maybe cheapest, they're near established infrastructure, which usually means closer to population centers.
But you see, placing a huge critical facility like that near a large urban area dramatically increases its exposure to things like political unrest, potential terrorism, even just general traffic congestion, which, slows down emergency response times. So providers often look for more remote locations for secrecy maybe, or just lower operating costs.
Okay, but then you hit another trade-off, right?
Precisely. The trade-off becomes finding and keeping high-quality technical talent. Those skilled data center engineers, the security personnel, they generally prefer living closer to urban centers for obvious reasons. If your state-of-the-art facility is, out in the middle of nowhere, well, repair times can slow down, staff turnover might increase. It's a tough balance.
And beyond just the operational convenience, selecting the location is pure risk analysis, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The provider has to evaluate the probability of pretty much every natural disaster you can imagine. Is this site prone to coastal flooding? Is it sitting on a major geological fault line prone to earthquakes? What's the risk profile for severe storms, tornadoes, wildfires? All of it.
And that's just natural disasters.
Right. And for providers with a global footprint, they also have to weigh political stability and the risk of civil unrest in the host country. Placing infrastructure in a region that offers massive tax breaks might look great on the balance sheet initially, but what if that region becomes unstable or experiences significant internal conflict? Your data center could potentially be nationalized, seized by a new regime, or just rendered completely inaccessible. The provider has to carefully assess whether those potential cost savings truly outweigh the long-term sovereign risk.
Okay, so once the physical site is chosen and secured, the provider then focuses on the hardware baseline, making sure the lowest level components are buttoned down.
Exactly. That includes things like the BIOS configuration and ensuring proper, secure firmware flashing. These are controls usually buried deep within the hardware stack, often invisible to the customer.
Right, but critical nonetheless.
Absolutely critical. And probably most importantly, they have to correctly set up the Trusted Platform Module, the TPM.
The TPM. Could you explain that a bit more?
Sure. The TPM is essentially a dedicated crypto processor. It's designed specifically to secure the hardware itself. It dictates exactly how cryptographic functions can be executed and, crucially, ensures that the system boots up in a known, secure state, a trusted state. It establishes this sort of chain of trust that every logical security control built on top will later rely upon. If that initial TPM configuration is weak or compromised, the entire foundation for encryption and system integrity is undermined right from the start.
Got it. So physical location, hardware baseline. What about the environment inside the data center? Availability isn't just about preventing attacks, it's also about keeping the hardware from, well, melting down.
Precisely. Environmental controls are absolutely crucial. The industry standards here generally come from ASHRE, that's the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers.
And what do they dictate?
ASHRE sets the optimal operating environment. We're looking for a temperature range generally between 18 and 27 degrees Celsius. That's about 64 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. This range is critical because it ensures the machinery performs optimally, preventing overheating, extending the life of expensive components, and also it needs to be tolerable for the human staff who have to work in there.
Okay, temperature makes sense. But you mentioned humidity earlier. That seems equally vital, maybe even harder to control.
It is. Relative humidity needs to be maintained very tightly, typically between 40 and 60%. If the air gets too humid, you risk accelerating corrosion on all those sensitive, expensive electronic components. Circuit boards don't like moisture. But if the air gets too dry, say below 40%, you face a different danger, a buildup of static electricity. Static discharge can easily damage components or even ignite flammable materials, creating a serious fire risk. It requires constant, precise monitoring and adjustment.
So managing this massive heat load efficiently is key. How do data centers do that? I've heard about hot and cold aisles.
Yes, the hot and cold aisle configuration is fundamental to cooling efficiency. Servers are arranged in rows, intentionally designed to pull cool, conditioned air in from the cold aisle, which is the front of the rack. Then they exhaust the hot air generated by the components out into the hot aisle at the back. More advanced facilities use sophisticated containment systems, maybe raised floors for underfloor cooling, or chimney racks that vent heat upwards to prevent that hot exhaust air from recirculating back into the cold air intakes.
Because recirculation would just kill efficiency.
Dramatically. It reduces cooling efficiency and drives up energy costs exponentially. So managing airflow is paramount.
Okay, temperature, humidity, airflow. What about fire? If something does catch fire, you obviously can't just spray water everywhere.
Absolutely not. You can't use a conductive liquid like water on millions of dollars worth of active powered electronics. That would cause far more damage. So we rely on what are called clean agents. These are non-water-based fire suppression systems. Common examples are gases like hydrogen, argonite, or chemical agents like FM200.
And how do they work?
They typically work either by displacing the oxygen in the room to below the level needed for combustion, or by rapidly absorbing heat from the fire. The key things are that they're non-conductive and they leave no residue, minimizing damage to the sensitive equipment.
It's also important to understand fire classifications, right?
Yes, definitely. Fires are classified based on the type of fuel involved. Class A is for ordinary combustibles, wood, paper, things like that. Class B is for flammable liquids, oil, gasoline. Class C is specifically for electrical fires, where electrical current is a factor. And Class D involves combustible metals or chemicals, which are less common in typical data centers, but still possible. These clean agent systems are primarily designed to handle Class C electrical fires, and often Class A fires too, without destroying the C-class equipment in the process.
Moving on from environmental hazards, let's talk power. Power continuity seems like the ultimate measure of availability in this physical realm. I know the industry benchmark is often 5 nines.
That's right. 5 nines 9 at 99.999% uptime. It's an incredibly aggressive standard. If you do the math, it allows for only about 6 minutes of unscheduled downtime in an entire year. Achieving that level requires multiple layers of redundancy to address power loss from all sorts of causes, planned maintenance, unexpected natural events, or even just strain on the local utility grid.
So what's the first line of defense against power interruptions?
Usually it starts at the component level with uninterruptible power supplies, or UPS systems.
What exactly does a UPS do?
A UPS serves two really vital roles. First, it conditions the incoming power from the utility. It smooths out minor fluctuations, protects against voltage surges or sags that could damage sensitive equipment. Second, and more critically, it provides instantaneous battery-based backup power during that very brief gap, often just milliseconds between the main utility power failing and the massive backup generator spooling up and taking over the load. This prevents a sudden, jarring shutdown and reboot of critical hardware.
Okay, so the UPS handles the immediate switchover. Then the heavy lifting comes to the backup generator.
Exactly, and these are enormous diesel generators typically. Best practices dictate that a high availability data center must store a minimum of 12 hours worth of fuel on site, ready to go at a moment's notice. Furthermore, their business continuity plan needs to detail pre-negotiated contracts with fuel suppliers. These contracts guarantee priority delivery during an emergency, ensuring they can get fuel for up to, say, 72 hours of necessary reliance.
Why 72 hours?
That planning assumes a potential regional disaster scenario where the main utility grid might be completely offline for days. In that situation, the supply chain for diesel fuel itself will be heavily stressed. If you don't have that 72-hour contract locked down, you're seriously risking a prolonged outage once your on-site fuel runs out.
Makes sense. But what if the failure isn't inside the data center itself, but happens upstream at the external utility provider? Or maybe the network connection goes down.
That's precisely why multi-vendor pathway connectivity is absolutely non-negotiable for any high-tier data center facility. This means you need redundant utility feeds for both power and network access coming into the data center. And critically, these feeds must come from separate, independent providers, or at the very least, travel via physically separate routes or pathways.
So if a construction crew accidentally cuts a fiber optic cable in one part of the city,
The second line, which was maybe buried along a completely different street, remains active. Same for power. If one utility substation goes down due to a storm or equipment failure, the second, independent substation, is hopefully still supplying power. It's all about eliminating single points of failure outside the building.
okay, these different levels of redundancy and resilience are often categorized using tiers, right? The Uptime Institute tiers.
Yes, providers rely heavily on the Uptime Institute's 4-tier classification system. It's a standardized way to communicate their facility's level of availability and fault tolerance to potential customers. This allows you, the customer, to select a facility whose capabilities actually match your business requirements, like your recovery time objective.
So what are the lower tiers like? Tier 1 and Tier 2.
Tier I and Tier 2 represent the, lower levels of resilience. A Tier I facility, for example, typically offers just a single non-redundant path for power and cooling distribution. It allows for up to 28.8 hours of annual downtime. Tier 2 is slightly better, usually adding some redundancy and capacity components, but still has only a single distribution path. Crucially, both Tier 1 and Tier 2 facilities generally require scheduled shutdowns for necessary maintenance. You can't easily fix or replace a critical component without taking the entire IT operation offline. They're suitable for maybe small to medium businesses with less stringent uptime needs.
Then you get to Tier 3. That seems to be a significant benchmark, often referred to as concurrently maintainable.
It absolutely is a major structural leap. Tier 3 facilities guarantee a much higher level of availability, typically 99.982% uptime. That translates to only about 1.6 hours of allowed annual downtime. The key phrase is concurrently maintainable. It means the facility has redundant capacity components like multiple UPS units, generators, cooling systems, and multiple independent distribution paths for power and cooling. This architecture allows you to remove or perform maintenance on any single capacity component or distribution path without impacting the ongoing IT operations. You can take one power feed down for work, and the other keeps everything running. It's a huge operational advantage. Many major cloud providers aim for Tier 3 compliance.
And at the very top, there's Tier 4, known as fault tolerant.
Tier 4 represents the pinnacle, the highest standard of data center availability. It aims for 99.995% uptime, which is roughly only 25 minutes of downtime allowed per year. This tier requires 2 entirely independent active utility power feeds coming into the building. It also demands the ability to sustain a 96-hour power outage solely on its backup generation capacity and stored fuel without any external utility support. Architecturally, it often requires what's called 2N+1 redundancy, meaning essentially 2 complete independent systems N for everything, plus 1 full backup system, plus 1 available for all critical functions. This extreme level of availability is typically reserved for operations where even a minute of downtime is catastrophic. Think major financial institutions, critical government functions, air traffic control.
Okay, that covers the physical bedrock thoroughly. Now let's cross that line from the physical realm into the logical. Here, the provider's ability to maintain resilience shifts away from diesel fuel and coolant and more towards software, abstraction, and intelligent orchestration. And this really starts with the heart of cloud computing, virtualization.
Right. And at the core of virtualization is the hypervisor. You can think of the hypervisor as the operating system for the cloud. It's that critical software layer that creates, runs, and manages every single virtual machine or VM. It is, without question, the single most critical security control managed by the provider, especially in infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, pay-as models.
Yeah.
If the hypervisor gets compromised, the entire platform is potentially compromised.
So the primary security challenge with hypervisors is isolation, isn't it? If I'm running my sensitive database VM on the same physical server as my competitor's web server VM, I need absolute assurance that my VM cannot see, access, or interfere with theirs.
Logical isolation is paramount. The hypervisor must rigorously segregate memory spaces, processor scheduling, network access, and storage I/O for every single tenant VM running on that host. Providers have to continuously test this isolation using sophisticated, often custom-built, sandboxed environments. These tests aim to prevent any inter-VM attacks or data leakage between tenants. They verify the robustness of things like memory segregation mechanisms and the hypervisor's privilege enforcement.
But there's a specific, really scary threat related to this isolation known as guest escape. Can you explain what that is and why it's such a major concern?
Guest escape is basically the nightmare scenario for cloud providers. It occurs when a virtual machine, which has already been compromised by an attacker, maybe through a vulnerability in the guest OS or an application, manages to break out of its supposedly secure virtual boundary. It essentially escapes its sandbox and gains access to the underlying host operating system, or perhaps the hypervisor itself, or even other resources on that same physical machine. This could potentially give the attacker the keys to control or spy on neighboring tenant VMs. It often exploits vulnerabilities within the hypervisor code itself.
Okay, terrifying. So how do providers defend against that possibility?
The defense relies on comprehensive host isolation techniques. This involves rigorous hardening of the hypervisor's own operating system, minimizing its attack surface, removing any unnecessary drivers or services, implementing strict mandatory access controls. Furthermore, providers heavily leverage hardware features like processor virtualization extensions, Intel VTX, AMDV. These provide hardware-assisted isolation, making it much harder for even a logical software vulnerability in the hypervisor to jump that boundary and access unauthorized memory or resources. And this is also where that physical security we talked about earlier, like the TPM, connects back to logical security. A properly configured TPM helps enforce the chain of trust right up to the hypervisor level, ensuring it hasn't been tampered with.
Okay, moving up the stack slightly from the hypervisor itself, we encounter middleware. This is sort of the glue between the operating system and the applications people run. Securing this seems to depend heavily on having a strong security baseline for the OS first.
Absolutely. That OS baseline demands rigorous configuration management from the get-go. This means immediately removing all default administrative accounts, closing every single unused network communication port, disabling unnecessary services, and ensuring robust auditing and logging are enabled from the moment the OS is installed or the VM image is created. If you just leave the default settings on an OS image, you're basically putting out a welcome mat for attackers.
Now, there's a unique security headache in cloud environments that revolves around virtual machine images. These are essentially static blueprints, snapshot of an OS and its configuration, stored as files.
Exactly. And the dilemma is pretty simple but significant. While a VM image is inactive, just sitting there in storage as a file, it can't receive security patches. So if a major vulnerability like a critical remote code execution flaw is discovered in Windows or Linux today, every single dormant VM image based on that vulnerable version stored by the provider or the customer becomes instantly vulnerable.
That sounds like a huge gap. How do you mitigate that risk between the static stored image and the dynamic running VM?
The standard mitigation is to enforce a mandated security configuration check upon VM activation or boot up. Before a newly launched virtual machine is allowed to fully join the network and start processing data, some kind of policy agent or scanner runs a verification check. This scan must confirm that the image meets the latest required security baseline. Does it have the latest critical patches? Are certain required security configurations enabled? If it fails this check, the VM should be automatically quarantined, blocked from network access, or perhaps prevented from booting altogether until remediated.
And this whole patching issue brings up the shared responsibility question again, particularly around OS version control. If I, as a customer, choose an infrastructure as a service model who's responsible for patching the guest operating system running inside my VM,
in IaaS, that responsibility falls squarely on you, the customer. You manage the OS, the middleware, the applications, and therefore you are responsible for patching them. This gives you maximum flexibility to run whatever you need. However, if you move to platform as a service, PaaS, or software as a service, or SaaS, the provider typically assumes most, or sometimes all, of that patching burden for the underlying OS and platform components. But even in PaaS, the provider is constantly performing this balancing act between enforcing security mandates, like patching deadlines, and accommodating the customer's need for stability or compatibility, often leading them to maintain support for multiple older versions of operating systems or application runtimes. It's a complex operational challenge.
Okay, let's talk about something absolutely critical, the management plane. You described the hypervisor as the heart or engine. What's the management plane?
If the hypervisor is the engine, then the management plane, sometimes called the control plane, is the centralized nervous system and brain of the entire cloud environment. It's the interface usually accessed through web portals, command line tools, or increasingly sophisticated APIs that you, the customer, or the provider's administrators use to provision, configure, orchestrate, and manage literally every resource in the cloud. We're talking networks, storage volumes, security groups, firewall rules, identity access, compute instances, everything.
So if that gets compromised,
A successful compromise of the management plane is the ultimate keys to the kingdom breach. An attacker gaining control here potentially gains instant centralized administrative control over thousands of tenant environments and all their associated infrastructure and data. And history is unfortunately full of examples of major cloud outages, not necessarily security breaches, but massive availability failures that were caused simply by misconfigurations made within the management plane itself, a typo in a deployment script, a flawed logic update.
given that catastrophic potential, the security priority here must be extremely high.
Off the charts high. Access to the management plane must be locked down with extreme prejudice. We're talking about enforcing the absolute strictest access control policies, mandatory multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all administrative actions, not just login. And for the provider's own staff, stringent privileged access management, PM tools are essential. Any administrative access requires detailed logging, auditing, maybe even real-time session monitoring or recording. There's zero room for error here.
And what about the operational risks that come with having everything so centralized through this plane?
That's a great point. Insufficient redundancy or even subtle architectural mistakes within the management plane's own infrastructure can instantly compromise the efficiency, stability, and availability of the entire cloud deployment it manages. Because everything flows through it, a failure in the orchestration logic, maybe a simple software bug, or a delayed response from a critical API endpoint within the plane could prevent thousands of customer resources from scaling properly, deploying new instances, or even booting up existing ones. This really underscores why high availability at the logical control layer is just as critical as that physical Tier 4 redundancy we discussed earlier.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to networking within the cloud. How do you securely operate a multi-tenant environment where different customers are sharing the same physical network hardware? Segmentation must be key.
Absolutely. The network must be logically segmented, even when the underlying switches and routers are shared. The basic, fundamental building block for achieving this logical segmentation remains the Virtual Local Area Network, or VLAN.
Right, VLANs allow us to logically group ports on a switch and treat them as separate broadcast domains, effectively isolating traffic between different groups, even if they're plugged into the same physical hardware. It's effective, but managing potentially thousands of VLANs across huge infrastructure can get cumbersome.
VLANs provide that essential baseline isolation, ensuring, for example, that customer A's finance department traffic is logically separated from customer B's development network traffic, even if they reside on the same physical host sometimes. But the real game changer for network security and agility in modern cloud environments is software-defined networking, or SDN.
SDN, that's the abstraction layer for the network, right? Decoupling the network intelligence from the physical hardware.
Precisely. SDN achieves this separation by splitting the traditional network device architecture into two distinct parts, the control plane and the data plane. The control plane holds all the intelligence, the routing protocols, the access control lists, the security policies, the overall network map. This is centralized, often in software controllers. The data plane is then just the physical hardware, the switches and routers, whose job is simply to forward packets according to the instructions received from the centralized control plane. This centralization allows all network configuration and management to be done programmatically, usually via APIs.
And what's the major security benefit that SDN enables? I often hear about microsegmentation.
Microsegmentation is arguably the most revolutionary security benefit derived from SDN. It fundamentally changes the defense in-depth posture inside the network. In a traditional network, once an attacker gets past the perimeter firewall, they often have relatively free rein to move laterally within that network segment, probing other servers. With SDN, however, you can deploy inexpensive, highly granular virtual firewalls or security policies around individual workloads, not just broad network subnets, but potentially around single virtual machines or even specific application tiers within a VM.
So that means if, say, one web server VM gets compromised.
The attacker can't easily jump from that compromised web server to the adjacent database server or to another web server in the same cluster because a virtual firewall policy enforced by the SDN controller at the hypervisor or virtual switch level is actively blocking that lateral movement by default.
Wow, okay, so it really restricts the blast radius of a compromise.
Correct. The policy engine within the SDN controller can enforce these tiny, precise security rules across the entire virtual network fabric, almost like giving every VM its own personal firewall. This capability drastically restricts an attacker's ability to pivot and spread within the environment, making microsegmentation an absolutely essential component of implementing a zero-trust architecture within the cloud platform.
All right, we've covered the physical and logical infrastructure. Now let's move up to the information hosted on that infrastructure, the data itself. Let's solidify the ownership and administrative responsibilities here, because this is where the legal risks often really reside.
This is probably one of the most critical points to understand, and it's an unwavering law of cloud security. Regardless of the service model you're using, whether it's EMIS, POWIS, or SaaS, the customer is always the data owner and the data controller. You, the customer, retain 100% legal accountability for the protection, classification, and regulatory compliance related to your data. That responsibility never transfers to the cloud provider, even if they are storing or processing the data for you.
Okay, that's clear. The customer owns the data and the risk. But there are different administrative roles involved in handling that data within the cloud environment. Can you break those down?
Sure. We generally distinguish between a few key roles. First, you have the data processor. This is typically the cloud provider themselves. They are handling or processing the data on behalf of the customer according to the customer's explicit instructions, usually defined in the contract or service agreement. Second, there's the data custodian. This is more of a technical operational role. The custodian is responsible for the day-to-day management of the data security controls, implementing backups, ensuring availability, managing encryption keys, perhaps. They manage the how of protection. Third, you have the data steward. This role is focused on governance and compliance. The steward is responsible for defining the data's classification. For example, is it public, internal, .confidential, .sensitive, ensuring its quality and accuracy, and making sure its use aligns with corporate policies and relevant regulations like GDPR or IPI. The steward dictates what level of protection is needed and why.
So understanding those roles is crucial. Now, what if the customer decides they need to grant the provider administrative access, or maybe access for the third-party tool, like a cloud access security broker, a CASB, to manage security? That sounds like it needs very strict governance.
Oh, absolutely. Granting any third party, even a security tool like a CSB or the provider's own support staff, the ability to directly access, encrypt, decrypt, move, or delete your data immediately introduces significant complexity around chain of custody, liability, and potential risk. The customer must establish very explicit rules, documented approval processes, and clearly defined scope limitations before granting any kind of administrative access to their data environment. You need to know precisely what actions that CSP or that provider engineer is authorized to take, under what specific circumstances, and how those actions will be logged and audited.
So just assuming the provider or the third-party tool knows best and giving them broad permissions is a recipe for disaster.
It's a critical failure of oversight, yes.
Yeah.
You need explicit documented control.
Okay, let's talk about securing the data while it's actually stored in the cloud. Cloud environments offer a variety of storage types, right? Each suited for different things.
That's right. We generally categorize cloud storage based on how it's accessed and its typical persistence characteristics. A very common type is object storage. This is usually accessed via APIs like S3 APIs. It's highly scalable, often geographically distributed, and ideal for storing massive volumes of unstructured data, things like images, videos, log files, backups, static website content. Then there's volume storage, sometimes called block storage. This acts much more like a traditional virtualized hard drive that gets attached to a specific virtual machine. It's typically used for things like operating system installations, databases, or applications that need persistent block-level access. And finally, you often have ephemeral storage. This is temporary instance-attached storage. It's usually very fast, maybe local SSDs on the host, but the key thing is that any data stored on it vanishes the moment that specific virtual instance is terminated or stopped. It's good for temporary scratch space, caches, things like that.
Got it. So regardless of the storage type, the foundational principle for protecting the data itself, especially sensitive data, remains encryption at rest. But the big challenge there is always managing the cryptographic keys securely.
Key management is absolutely crucial, and it's handled primarily through two main mechanisms in the cloud. Most organizations, especially for general-purpose encryption, utilize the cloud provider's own key management service, KMS. A KMS offers convenience, scalability, and integrates well with other cloud services. The provider manages the underlying key storage infrastructure, but you, the customer, typically retain control over the key's lifecycle, creation, rotation, deletion, and critically, the access policies determining who or what can use the key to encrypt or decrypt data.
But the provider still ultimately manages the KMS hardware and software. What if you need an even higher level of assurance or control over the keys?
For maximum control and assurance, especially for highly regulated data or scenarios where key sovereignty is paramount, customers often turn to dedicated hardware security modules, HSMs. These can be offered as a service by the cloud provider or sometimes even involve deploying customer-managed HSMs within the cloud environment.
What's the fundamental difference in the level of assurance between using a provider's KMS and using an HSM?
An HSM is a specialized, physically hardened cryptographic processor. It's designed specifically and solely to store, manage, and perform cryptographic operations like key generation, encryption, digital signing, securely within its protected boundary. HSMs are typically validated against rigorous standards like FIPS 142, often at level 3 or higher, which provides strong physical tamper resistance and detection. Critically, an HSM is designed so that the cryptographic keys never leave the device in plain text form. They are generated inside, used inside, and stored inside. So if absolute key ownership control and non-repudiation are your highest priorities, an HSM gives you a degree of physical and logical assurance that a software-based KMS running on general-purpose hardware managed by the provider generally cannot match.
Interesting. Now, beyond just standard encryption, are there other techniques used in the cloud to enhance both the confidentiality and the resilience of stored data at the same time? I've heard terms like data dispersion.
Yes, data dispersion, sometimes also referred to as bit splitting or secret splitting, is a more sophisticated technique that addresses both confidentiality and availability. The basic idea is to take the original data, fragment it into multiple pieces using an algorithm, and then distribute those fragments across different physical storage systems. These systems might be in different racks, different availability zones, or even different geographic regions. The crucial part is that it often uses an erasure coding scheme, which adds some redundancy. This means you might only need a subset of the original fragment, say 3 out of 5 stored fragments, to successfully reconstruct the complete original data.
Ah, okay. So if an attacker manages to compromise just a single storage location or steal one disk,
They only get an unintelligible fragment, or maybe 2 fragments, which are useless on their own. They can't reconstruct the original data without obtaining the required threshold number of fragments, in our example 3. So it significantly boosts confidentiality because compromising one piece yields nothing meaningful.
and how does it help resilience?
It drastically boosts resilience because if 1 or even 2 of those storage systems were to fail completely due to hardware failure, power loss, etc., the original data can still be perfectly reconstructed from the remaining available fragments stored on the other systems. This ensures data availability even during partial system failures, often transparently to the application. It's a very powerful technique for critical data.
All right, let's shift gears to the threats and the controls needed for ongoing platform oversight. The cloud environment seems to introduce some new threat dynamics, especially concerning the concentrated power of administrators and the customer's necessary reliance on third-party assurance.
That's a good summary. The standard external threats, of course, are always present and often amplified. Things like massive distributed denial of service, DDoS attacks aiming to overwhelm infrastructure and crush availability are a constant concern for providers. And man-in-the-middle, MITM attacks, remain a critical threat, especially when you consider how much relies on secure remote administration, SSH sessions, API calls to the management plane, data transfers. Ensuring the integrity and confidentiality of those connections is vital.
But you mentioned the internal threat profile changes quite dramatically. While we often worry about the malicious insider intentionally causing harm, you pointed out earlier that most insider threats are actually accidental mistakes.
Yes, and that's a really critical distinction in the cloud context. A careless configuration change made by an administrator in a traditional on-premise environment might affect one server, maybe one application. Annoying, but contained. In a massive public cloud environment, however, a single misconfiguration deployed by a highly privileged cloud administrator, even if it's a completely honest mistake, a typo in a script can instantly impact hundreds or potentially thousands of customers simultaneously. This is due to the sheer scale and automation involved. The power vested in cloud administrators significantly magnifies the consequences of simple human error.
And for the customer using the cloud, we face these more abstract threats that stem from that fundamental lack of direct physical control over the infrastructure, right?
Exactly. If you don't own the data center, you simply cannot walk in and physically audit the HVAC systems yourself. You can't inspect the locks on the server cage doors or directly oversee the process for decommissioning and destroying old hard drives. You must rely almost entirely on contractual language in your service agreement and on third-party audit reports provided by the cloud vendor. Things like Service Organization Control, SOC, reports SOC 2 Type 2 being very common, or ISO 27001 certifications. And while these reports are valuable, they're often historical snapshots, looking back over a period. There's still a necessary element of trust involved, trusting the integrity of the provider's ongoing processes between audits.
It must also be incredibly challenging to enforce a perfectly uniform security policy across a highly decentralized platform, especially in models like a community cloud.
It is very difficult. In community cloud environments, where multiple organizations might share administrative responsibilities and resources, potentially for a specific industry or project, security policies can often diverge. This happens because the different member organizations might have slightly different regulatory requirements, risk appetites, or operational needs. Achieving and, more importantly, maintaining perfectly uniform security baselines and policies across all participants becomes a continuous compliance and governance battle. This can introduce vulnerabilities where a weakness might stem not from your own organization's failure, but from a partner's non-adherence to the agreed-upon standards within that shared environment.
Okay, so given this reliance on the provider and the shared nature of the platform, there needs to be careful coordination and oversight. This brings up a delicate balance regarding how much visibility the customer should have into the underlying platform operations.
That's right. The provider has an overarching security obligation to the entire platform and all its tenants, not just to one individual customer.
So you're saying the provider can't just open the floodgates and give a demanding customer absolutely all the logs and system data they ask for?
They absolutely should not. The provider must enforce a principle of least privilege when it comes to customer visibility into the underlying infrastructure and platform logs. They should only grant access to the logs and system data that are strictly necessary for that specific customer's legitimate purposes. Things like their own application performance monitoring, security event correlation for their resources, compliance auditing related to their environment. Granting excessive broad access to underlying platform details to one customer inadvertently gives them reconnaissance capabilities. They might learn about the internal network topology, specific software versions used by the provider, maybe even deduce information about the resources or locations of other customers sharing the same infrastructure. That's information a potential attacker could weaponize against the entire platform. A responsible provider must carefully limit visibility to protect all tenants.
Okay, that makes sense. So if customers can't fully audit everything themselves, how does the provider implement defense in depth across the whole platform they manage? What are some key controls they use?
Well, the first and perhaps most fundamental defense is relentless hardening of every component. This means aggressively reducing the attack surface by eliminating every unnecessary service, closing every unused network port, removing unneeded software packages from the hypervisor operating system, the management plane components, and even the base VM images they might offer. If a service or feature isn't absolutely essential for the platform's function, it gets removed or disabled. Minimize the target. The second major area involves robust personnel controls, specifically governing the actions of their own highly privileged administrative staff who operate the platform.
Right. Could you talk about things like mandatory vacations and job rotation? They sound a bit like standard HR policies, but I understand they serve a real security purpose here.
They are absolutely critical security controls, primarily aimed at detecting or preventing fraud and identifying configuration drift or unauthorized changes. Mandatory vacations force an administrator who might potentially be involved in ongoing fraud or perhaps maintaining unauthorized shadow configurations to step away completely for a week or two. While they are gone, another administrator has to take over their duties. This cross-training inherently forces review of the systems and configurations, making it much more likely that any anomalies, unauthorized activities, or simply neglected tasks will be exposed. Job rotation achieves a similar goal by preventing any single individual from becoming indispensable or maintaining sole control over a critical, sensitive system for too long, reducing both error and fraud opportunities.
And for really significant changes to the platform, providers often enforce what's called two-person integrity, correct?
Yes, two-person integrity, sometimes called the two-person rule, is another vital control. It mandates that certain highly critical or sensitive configuration changes, think about things like updating the master firewall rules for the entire management plane, or decommissioning major storage arrays containing customer data, must be reviewed, approved, and potentially executed by at least two separate authorized individuals. In highly automated cloud environments, this is often enforced through strict approval gates built into the deployment pipelines or change management systems. It acts as a crucial check and balance, preventing a single person's error, or worse, malicious intent, from catastrophically impacting the entire platform or its customers.
Okay, so we have hardened systems, personnel controls. What about monitoring? How do providers and customers, for that matter, get centralized visibility into what's happening across this complex environment? That sounds like a job for some.
Exactly. For comprehensive monitoring and centralized visibility, both for the provider managing the platform and for the customer monitoring their own resources within it. The Security, Information, and Event Management SIEM system is really the core operational tool. Its primary function is to aggregate, correlate, and analyze log data pouring in from potentially thousands of sources. Network devices, servers, hypervisors, applications, databases, authentication systems, cloud provider APIs, everything.
But a SIEM is essentially just a massive data collector and correlation engine. It's only useful if it's configured intelligently, right? Yeah. What's the absolute first step to making a SIEM effective?
The foundational requirement, before you can even start writing effective detection rules, is thoroughly understanding your asset baseline and, critically, your normal operational baseline. You absolutely must know what normal looks like for your specific environment. What are the typical CPU and network utilization patterns for your key applications? What are the expected geographic locations for your administrator logins? What IP addresses normally communicate with your database servers? What is the normal volume and type of traffic flowing in and out? You have to quantify this baseline behavior.
Because if you don't know what normal looks like, the SIEM just becomes a massive flood of meaningless alerts, noise.
Precisely. Without a well-defined baseline, the SIEM will inevitably generate millions of alerts for benign activities, and human analysts will quickly become desensitized, suffering from alert fatigue. They'll start ignoring everything, and you'll inevitably miss the truly critical anomalies when they occur. Things like that sudden administrator login attempt from an unusual country you've never seen before, or that unexpected massive burst of outbound traffic from a server that normally doesn't send much data, possibly indicating data exfiltration, or a sudden spike in failed login attempts against a sensitive service. Effective SIEM use relies on first establishing that baseline, then writing rules to specifically detect deviations, the anomalies, and correlating disparate events across different log sources to piece together a potential attack or a multi-stage intrusion.
Makes sense. Understand normal before you can detect abnormal. Okay, for our final section, let's focus on survival. What happens when, despite all these defenses, the worst occurs? A major outage, a natural disaster, a catastrophic failure. We need to ensure the business and technical systems can recover. This brings us to business continuity and disaster recovery.
Right. And it's important to distinguish between these two related but distinct concepts. Business continuity, BC, is the broader, more strategic discipline. It focuses on the overall continuance of essential business operations during and after a disruption. It encompasses people, processes, facilities, supply chains, the whole picture needed for the business to keep functioning at some acceptable level. Disaster recovery, DR, on the other hand, is typically considered the more tactical, IT-focused subset of business continuity. DR deals specifically with the technical recovery and restoration of the IT systems, infrastructure, and data that support those critical business operations.
Okay, BC is the big picture strategy. DR is this technical recovery tactic. Regardless of the plan, the priorities during an actual event must always be crystal clear starting with the human element, correct?
Absolutely, without question. The number one priority in any disaster scenario is always human safety. This includes ensuring timely evacuation, accounting for all personnel, providing for their immediate safety needs, potentially including things like emergency rations, water, or first aid if staff are trapped or displaced for a period. Systems and data come second to people. The secondary priority, once human safety is addressed, is typically protecting the systems and facilities from further damage, and then initiating the recovery process to restore critical business operations according to predefined priority tiers established in the planning phase.
And the decision to actually invoke these plans to declare an official disaster needs to be fast and objective, doesn't it? We can't rely on someone's gut feeling in the heat of the moment.
No, that often leads to costly delays. Disasters should ideally be declared based on specific, predefined, objective operational criteria or availability metrics. For example, if critical system X is down for more than 4 hours, or if the primary data center is inaccessible due to flooding, then a disaster is automatically declared. This removes subjective human judgment under pressure and triggers the response process quickly. And when that declaration happens, specific roles and responsibilities. Who is the overall crisis coordinator? Who leads the technical recovery teams? Who handles internal and external communications, including media response, must be immediately assigned to designated individuals who have been trained and prepared for those precise tasks. Chaos is the enemy here.
So the entire recovery architecture, how quickly you need to recover, how much data you can afford to lose, all of that is dictated by key metrics that should be established beforehand, usually during something called a business impact analysis, or BIA.
Exactly. The BIA is the foundational process where the organization analyzes its critical business functions and determines the financial and operational impact of them being unavailable. This analysis drives the definition of several key recovery metrics.
Let's start with probably the most common one, the Recovery Point Objective, or RPO. What does that define?
The RPO defines the maximum acceptable amount of data loss the organization can tolerate for a specific system or process, measured back in time from the point of disruption. So if your RPO for your customer order database is 4 hours, it means the business has decided it can afford to potentially lose up to 4 hours worth of transaction data entered just before the disaster hit. This metric directly dictates your required backup frequency or data replication strategy.
So a lower RPO means you need to back up more often.
Precisely. A very tight RPO, may be measured in minutes or even seconds, typically requires expensive, continuous data replication technologies between your primary and recovery environments. A looser RPO, say 24 hours, might be achievable with simpler, less costly daily backups. Choosing the RPO has massive technical and cost implications, especially in the cloud, where you pay for storage and replication bandwidth.
Okay, that's data loss tolerance, RPO. What about the speed of recovery? That's the Recovery Time Objective, or RTO.
Correct. The RTO defines the target time within which a specific business process or IT system must be restored to operational capability after a disruption has occurred. It dictates how quickly your recovery site needs to be activated, how fast applications must be brought online, how quickly network traffic needs to be rerouted. If your critical billing system have an RTO of 8 hours, the technical disaster recovery team must ensure that system is back online and processing transactions within that 8-hour window following the disaster declaration.
And finally, there's a related metric, the maximum allowable downtime, sometimes called MTD or MAD. How does that differ from RTO?
The MTD represents the absolute maximum amount of time that a critical business function or system can be unavailable before the organization faces irreversible harm, catastrophic financial losses, or potentially complete business failure. It's the point of no return. MTD is often longer than the RTO. You target recovering within RTO, but the business can survive up to MTD. The MTD is a key factor in the overall business continuity strategy and, importantly, in the decision of when to formally declare a disaster. If the initial assessment suggests that the estimated time to recover, based on the RTO plan, is likely going to exceed the MTD, then you've passed a critical threshold, and the BC plan might need to immediately pivot towards activating long-term manual workarounds or alternative strategies to ensure basic business survival, because IT recovery alone won't be fast enough.
Okay, so you have the plan, you have the metrics. But a plan sitting on a shelf is useless unless you know it actually works.
Yeah.
Regular testing seems absolutely essential.
It's the only way to validate that the plan, the procedures, the technology, and the people will actually function as expected when adrenaline is high, systems are failing for real, and communication is difficult. A DR plan is purely theoretical until it's been successfully tested. We generally rely on a tiered approach to testing, balancing the resource impact and cost against the level of realism and assurance provided. The simplest and least disruptive is the tabletop test or walkthrough.
What does that involve?
In a tabletop test, the key members of the DR team gather in a room and verbally walk through a specific disaster scenario and the documented recovery procedures step by step. It's low impact, primarily focused on validating roles and responsibilities, checking communication plans, ensuring everyone understands the documentation, and identifying obvious gaps in the procedures.
Okay, so that's a discussion. What's the next step up? A dry run?
Yes. A dry run, sometimes called a parallel test, is more intensive and logistically involved. The team actually starts to implement some of the processes. Maybe they initiate the emergency notification call trees. Perhaps key personnel physically travel to the designated recovery site. They might try accessing recovery documentation from off-site locations. However, they stop short of actually manipulating production data or failing over live systems. It tests the logistical aspects and coordination without risking production.
And the ultimate validation comes from a full test.
The full test, or full interruption test, provides the highest level of assurance, but also carries the highest risk and cost. This involves actually performing a failover of critical systems to the recovery site, potentially using live production data or a very recent full mirror copy. It provides the most realistic feedback on technical shortcomings. Did the network actually reroute correctly? Did the applications come up cleanly on the recovery systems? Did the data backups restore without corruption? For maximum realism and assessment of staff readiness under pressure, full tests are sometimes even conducted unscheduled, catching the staff genuinely off guard to see how they react.
And in today's complex, often automated cloud architectures, there's another approach gaining traction: chaos engineering. How does that fit into testing resilience?
Chaos engineering is less about testing the recovery plan after a disaster, and more about proactively testing the inherent resilience of the production architecture itself. It's the practice of intentionally and carefully injecting controlled faults into your live production or pre-production system, things like randomly terminating virtual machine instances, simulating network latency spikes between services, deliberately failing a critical dependency like a database or authentication service. The goal is to continuously verify that your architecture is truly fault-tolerant and resilient by design. Does the system gracefully handle the failure of a component without causing a user-facing outage? It forces you to build systems that can withstand these kinds of strange and unpredictable failure scenarios that inevitably happen in large-scale distributed cloud environments, validating your design assumptions against reality.
Wow, okay. We have certainly journeyed through a comprehensive landscape today, covering infrastructure security from the concrete physical requirements of, say, a Tier 4 data center, all the way up to the abstract logical principles of virtualization, data governance, and ultimately business resilience planning. If there's one primary lesson to take away, it seems to be the critical importance of understanding and managing that shared responsibility model in the cloud. You, as the customer, must maintain rigorous oversight and demand transparency regarding the provider's platform security, especially concerning those foundational layers like the hypervisor and the management plane, because, as you said, the integrity of those layers really determines your ultimate security posture.
That's absolutely right. And that security posture ultimately needs to be measured and validated against your business needs. We spent a fair bit of time detailing those key metrics, RPO and RTO. My final thought for you, the listener, to carry forward is this. Take a hard look at the RPO and RTO metrics that are currently defining your organization's cloud recovery architecture. Are they genuinely aligned with what your business truly needs to survive a significant disruption? And perhaps more importantly, have you actually verified through rigorous, realistic testing that the technical controls and recovery procedures you have deployed in the cloud are actually sufficient to meet those exact non-negotiable targets when things go wrong? Answering that question honestly dictates your required ongoing investment in security and resilience.
Excellent point to end on. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to check out our CISSP playlist for other domains.